Hey there! Today I wanted to analyze some very instructive traps that we can get in a very common and challenging line in the two knights defense. We're gonna cover traps for both colors, so after e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to c4, and knight to f6, we get the two knights defense. And here a very common and interesting move for white is the move knight to g5. On one hand, white is moving a piece twice in the opening, which is normally not a good idea, but white has a very concrete idea of attacking the pawn f7. And here black can stop that with the move d5, which is the most common move that we'll cover here. Black also has a very wild and interesting idea, which is to go bishop to c5, which I have covered in a separate video that you might want to check after watching this video. I have a link to that video in the description. But the move d5 makes a lot of sense, preventing the attack on f7, at least temporarily. And here after white takes with the pawn, we're gonna start with the first trap for white. If you're not familiar with this position, the very natural move knight takes d5 is actually extremely dangerous for black because here white has the move knight takes f7, which is known as the fright lever attack. We get a pawn and we're forking the rook and the queen, that's why black has to take the knight. And after queen to f3, we fork the king and the knight, so the only way to keep the material is to go king to e6. And the king on e6 is going to be quite shaky. Here white can continue with knight to c3, developing and increasing the pressure on the knight on d5, which is pinned. And here black normally goes knight c to b4 to defend the knight. Knight c to e7 is quite passive, it blocks the bishop. So here white can continue with the move d4, which is a very common idea in this position, as we'll see later. Now we are opening lines against the king, and taking on d5 here is actually quite bad because white can simply go queen to e4, giving a check, and then capturing on d5. So defending the knight with knight c to b4 is more accurate. There's also an idea to take on c2. And here the simplest for white is to simply castle. Now black is no time to take on c2 because we're gonna capture on d5 with check. That's why c6 protects the knight on d5. And overall this position is just very dangerous for black with the king on e6. White can continue with this idea of d4, trying to open lines against the king. And just to show you how black can go wrong easily here, after knight takes e2, we can simply ignore the threat of taking on a1, we can simply take on e5. And after knight takes a1, rook to d1, we're going to crush black. There's a pin on the knight on d5, so we're going to capture on d5, and this king on e6 is not going to survive for a long time. Instead of taking on c2, here black can try queen to f6. Here we're looking at the best moves for black. And here white has a few options. I like queen to e2, keeping an eye on e5, now defending c2. And with perfect play, black might hold this position, but just to show you how black can easily go wrong with a natural move like bishop to d6, developing and defending on e5, we can kick away the knight, and after knight to a6, go f4, we're gonna get more material, open more lines against black's pieces, so this position is already desperate for black. So after d5, e takes d5, taking on d5 is actually not a very good idea, we're gonna see better options for black. And after knight takes d5, if you don't feel too comfortable sacrificing on f7 straight away, there's another very good alternative for white, which is the move d4. So we've seen this idea in the previous line, we want to open lines for our pieces, now the bishop is defending knight on g5, so we're ready to take on f7 under better circumstances. For example, if black goes h6, now we can simply take and then go for this line with an extra tempo of going d4. The move d4 also has the idea of taking on e5 to put more pressure on the knight on d5. So black pretty much has to take on d4. If black takes with the pawn, then here we have the very simple short castle. We're ready to go rook to e1. And just to show you a very nice continuation, black might try to close the e-file after bishop to e6 and rook to e1. If black goes queen to d7, now we can again sacrifice on f7. The bishop is pinned, so black cannot take with the bishop. If black takes with the queen, then we're gonna take on d5. And if black takes with the king, after queen to f3, we get this queen to f3 idea, and we can get the material back straight away. For example, after king to g8, here we get rook takes e6, just getting the material back and crushing black. After queen takes, we can take with the bishop and win the queen, and we can even go queen takes e5. The point being that after queen takes and bishop takes, we get a very pretty checkmate. So after rook to e1, if black goes bishop to e7, trying to castle at any cost, here taking on e6 with the knight is quite good, but we also have the very pretty rook takes e6, and after black takes on e6, knight takes e6, black is not going to castle, we attack the queen, And the point is that we are even winning material because we can take on d5, and black cannot take on d5 back because after knight takes e7, we're going to win black's queen. Now in the previous lines, everything went well for white, but this line of going d5 is actually quite playable for black. The main point is not to take back on d5. After d5 and e takes e5, we're gonna cover some very interesting traps for black. That's why we're taking that line from black's side. After e takes e5, the main line is to go knight to a5, and the main point is to attack the bishop, and black is going to get a very quick development. For example, after bishop to b5, c6, white takes, white gets an extra pawn, but the main point is that now we are attacking the bishop and we're ready to kick away the knight on g5. Black's bishops are going to develop very quickly, so black has compensation for the pawn. And besides knight to a5, black has other interesting alternatives to invite white to go wrong. One of them is to go knight to d4, and here the best continuation for white is to go c3, attacking the knight, and here black has a few options. Black can try to counterattack with b5, or even go knight to f5. But here the move d6 might look quite tempting because we are insisting with this idea of attacking on f7. But here black has the very strong queen takes d6, just ignoring that threat of taking on f7, and black is doing great in this position. For example, after knight takes f7, even though white is forking the queen and the rook, after queen to c6, black is getting a very nice position. The pressure on g2 is going to be a very common idea in this line. For example, here if white takes on h8, we can take on g2, we attack the rook, and after rook to f1, queen to e4, we give a check. If white blocks with the queen, we're gonna take the queen with the knight, or after bishop to e2, we get a very pretty checkmate after knight to f3. So after queen takes d6, taking on f7 is not a good idea. White could castle here, but in these positions we're ready to go bishop to g4, we get very quick development, and the other alternative is to take on f7 with the bishop, and after king to e7, black's pieces might look clumsy, but black is ready to counterattack the knight and take the bishop. That's why here bishop to b3 makes a lot of sense. And now we can simply take this very strong bishop, and after white takes back, we can go h6, kicking back the knight, and after knight to f3, e4. Here the relatively best for white is to go knight to g1, and then after king to f7, black has great compensation for the pawn. And after knight to h4, again now we play king to f7. The king here is actually very safe. White doesn't have enough pieces to attack. And now we even plan to go g5, trapping this knight. So here white might try g3, but after the move g5 and knight to g2, now we get bishop to g4, and this queen on d1 is gonna get trapped after f3 and bishop takes f3. And before I move on to the last trap, if you want to seriously get better at chess, I have a free course that will provide you with a training plan for that, so feel free to check the link in the description. So here after d5, e takes e5, knight to d4 is an interesting idea to complicate the game, and there's another very crazy move that black has here, which is the move b5. So we are counter-attacking, and here the most natural move for white is not the best, which is taking on b5 with the bishop. If white takes on c6, we can simply take the bishop on c4. Just want to mention that the best move for white here, at least the most common move played by strong players, is to go bishop to f1. Definitely not easy if you had this position for the first time. And here black has many options to get a complicated game. Black can take on d5 with the knight or with the queen. Knight to d4 is also an alternative. But after b5, taking on d5 might look attractive because we capture a pawn and we pin the knight. But after queen takes d5, now black again, the main idea here is to get very quick development. We attack the bishop and the pawn on g2. We also have ideas to attack the knight by going e4 or h6. So overall black is doing very fine here. And if white tries to get greedy after bishop takes and queen takes, white might try to invite a trade of queens after queen to f3, since white is a pawn up. And overall here black gets a lot of compensation for the pawn with these two very nice bishops. Here the move e4 is quite interesting. And after the move queen to b3, which is the most ambitious one, trying to put pressure on f7, we can simply ignore this idea by going bishop to c5. And after queen takes and king to d8, white is getting pawns, but black is developing very quickly. Here white should castle, even though black is ready to bring a rook to f8, attacking the queen. And if white gets greedy after queen takes e7, here the move rook to g8 will simply activate the rook, and now we have an idea of taking the knight if the queen goes to f7. And after queen to h6, we have this very nice and common tactic. We can take the pawn f2, we give a check. Now the king won't be able to castle anymore, And white cannot even take the bishop on f2 because after the move knight to g4, we get a fork and we're going to capture the queen on h6. So hope that you enjoy these traps for white and black in the most critical line of the two knights defense and that you can implement them in your games. Thanks a lot for watching and I'll see you in the next video.